This is episode 646 of the Rio Grande Foundation's Tipping Point, New Mexico. I'm Paul Gessing, president of the Rio Grande Foundation, New Mexico's free market think tank. You can find out more about the foundation at riograndefoundation.org. I am very pleased to be joined this week by Peter Rice. He is everything, I believe, but you can clarify that at the Downtown Albuquerque News, an online
Not quite, but yes.
journalism site. Yeah, well, we can talk a little bit about more how your business is developing. But first and foremost, let me welcome you to Tipping Point, New Mexico. Thanks for coming on.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, so talk a little bit about your publication, which will form the basis of the next 45 or so minutes of our discussion. Downtown Albuquerque News. It's an online only journalism site, and you've been doing it for quite a while now, so talk a little bit about it.
Yeah, we just passed the 5th anniversary mark there, so something must be working. I guess just imagine a small town community newspaper from the days of yore, but it's digital and it's delivered by email to people on weekdays. And that's the basic vibe. There's a lot of stories in there about development and construction and the arts and what's that weird thing going on over there. But then there's kind of two major undercurrent stories. One being what does the future of Old Town / Sawmill hold, given the kind of new political energy there in Old Town, a lot of new development as well, and especially in Sawmill, of course, a lot going on there. But kind of the big one is what is the future of the downtown core, given that we all want it to be better. So we spend a lot of time on those two big questions, but then it's a lot of, oh, check it out, there's a new speed bump on this particular street in this neighborhood, adjacent to downtown or adjacent to Old Town.
Well, before we get into defining Downtown Albuquerque, how do people subscribe to your publication if they're interested?
They would go to downtownalbuquerquenews.com.
All right.
Take it from there.
Wonderful. And we have our subscription at the Rio Grande Foundation. And as folks may be aware, we are located in downtown Albuquerque in the historic Sims building. Gets a little mad. It's unfortunately or fortunately, the windows don't open and no cigarette smoking. And if you watched Mad Men, the parties are not nearly as cool nowadays as they were, at least on the show. So that was a heck of a TV show. Folks have the chance to watch it. But let's talk about downtown Albuquerque. How do you find, because you've already thrown out Sawmill and Old Town at me, and I will admit that I do not consider them part of Old Town because they were explicitly created because the railroad was going through an area that couldn't, deal with the flooding that we saw as a city way back in the late 1800s in Old Town. So how do you define downtown?
You're saying Sawmill is distinct from Old Town?
No, well, I'm saying
downtown.
It's distinct from downtown. Yeah, I'm
Yes.
going to say Sawmill and Old Town are distinct from downtown. But you
It's all very relative.
Yeah, sure.
I'd say there is a subset of the population that believes that basically everything south of I-40 and then between the river and I-25 is downtown. And the further away from that zone you get, I think the more people are likely to describe that as downtown. Now, within that zone, it's helpful to have a lot more names for the different areas around there. So there's no right or wrong way to do this. There's no official definition of what downtown is. It kind of varies from person to person, but I generally describe the area where the tall buildings are as the downtown core. Old Town is a little more easy to describe. And then the whole kind of adjacent neighborhoods around downtown and Old Town, I call greater downtown. So it's probably imperfect, but it's trying to synthesize where people are kind of at, even though they're at different places, into something that makes sense. So the downtown core is, yeah,
that's fair.
That's the place that needs the revitalization, more than, say, the Morelos neighborhood where I live, which is arguably somewhat downtownish, but doesn't have the same problems for sure.
Yeah. Well, let's talk a little bit about you and your work in journalism and why downtown Albuquerque. Not just why you want to cover downtown Albuquerque, but why is downtown an important part of Albuquerque? And we have listeners across the state of New Mexico, certainly some outside of New Mexico. But why is downtown Albuquerque important to the entire state? So that's kind of a
Money.
two-parter. Very good answer to a lot of questions, but we can also talk about you and your own personal experience and why you chose after your work in journalism, which you did previously work in journalism for other publications. Talk about that, and then why did you choose to go ahead and cover downtown as a specific interest?
Sure. So gosh, I got started in journalism pretty early at age 13, basically back in Washington State. I've worked at papers through college in Colorado, worked at a paper in Oregon after college. I've always just really liked journalism. It seems like something I'm kind of have a bit of a knack for, and so it seemed like a reasonable way to make a living. Of course, the industry was sort of collapsing around me at that point, so that assessment uh, seemed to be more and more of a problem as the years went on. But for a long time, I was sort of infuriated by the journalism business model, and
Hmm.
it's like the internet comes along, provides an infinite supply of advertising space. So obviously the price of it goes down, basic supply and demand stuff. But along those same supply and demand lines, I always figured, why not just carve out a journalistic niche and serve it well and charge money for for exclusive access to information about that niche. It seemed like a business model more or less as old as time, and I thought I'd give it a go. And since I live in a downtown adjacent neighborhood, it seemed like a pretty good meaty topic to take on. And of course, there's a lot going on in the neighborhoods around downtown and Old Town as well. So
Hmm.
plenty to talk about. So about 5.5 years ago, I just went for it, quit my job, and it's been paying the mortgage ever since.
Were you working in journalism prior to this effort?
No, I took a 7 or 8 year break there.
Okay,
Yeah, I became an electrician for a while. I worked in PR. I worked in video production. Yeah, it's sort of media adjacent to some
sure.
degree, except for the electrical. But yeah, it was always
Well,
journalism was the one that got away there. I had to get it back.
you can't work that TV and that radio without electricity, so there is a
That's
connection
that's
there.
true.
But anyway, well, let's move on to a little bit about downtown and its importance. You said money, which I know is a little bit of a glib response, but uh, downtown areas do tend to be where businesses are located. I know that's a kind of trite statement. It's not so much the way things are nowadays, but it certainly historically is what's driven the importance of downtown areas. Now, I will start this with a deviation in the sense that Albuquerque is very unique in many ways, but one of the unique things about Albuquerque is that I would say that its primary job and economic base is not downtown. It's out on base. It's Sandia National Lab, where a lot of people commute, and you really can't have anything resembling a traditional urban area because you're on a military installation that is secure. So, uh, but talk about just downtown and its importance and kind of how that situation or other things make downtown Albuquerque especially different or unique.
Sure. So, before I get into the money angle, there is a serious psychological component to this for a lot of people.
Hmm.
It's the heart of a city. It's the center of the state, arguably,
Hmm.
and people want that. For nostalgic, for just simple. They just want, as a matter of course, that their downtown look good and seem safe and be healthy. Um, but kind of below that, when we talk about the money, and it's not necessarily about businesses locating there, although that has been the MO since the Second World War. It's basically about everything being
Hmm.
located there. The advantage of urban density, whether we're talking about, something like Manhattan or something a lot smaller than that, the sort of classic model of, 3 and 4 story buildings packed in an area. You see that in Europe a lot, and in Mexico a lot,
Mhm.
sometimes in Canada. Um, that is to the extent you can concentrate taxpayers and tax generating activities in a small area, that is a tremendous advantage for the city as a whole and the state as a whole, because a lot of the expense of running a city or a state, less a state, but let's talk about the city. A lot of the expense of running the city has to do
Mhm.
with its physical size.
Mhm.
So the amount of tarmac you throw down, the length of pipe, the wires, all that stuff gets more expensive the bigger your city is. So to the extent you can concentrate a lot of tax generating activity in a small area, then you have a situation where your downtown is subsidizing the rest of town,
Mhm.
essentially.
Let me
And
jump in and
sure,
add one thing to that, and that is a topic that's near and dear, I'm sure, to your heart as well as mine. But mass transit.
yes,
If you can put lots of jobs and economic activity in a core area that is relatively walkable, you can at least make transit viable as a traffic reduction tool. Now, economically speaking, in this country, I don't think there's a single mass transit system anywhere, including the New York subway or the Washington Metro, that comes anywhere close to returning its money to the taxpayers. But you by having a walkable and densely packed area, it creates a kind of central artery for transit, ridership and activity, right?
yeah, mass transit works better in density situations in general, and yeah, I mean, there's some debate over its actual capacity to provide traffic reduction versus simply providing a reasonable alternative if you want to get somewhere. The same reason I can get to the west side a lot faster on the art bus than other people at 5 p.m. On a weekday. Um, but so yeah, there's a lot of advantages there. I mean, you mass transit can save you a lot of money at that point because you don't have to build a lot of extra roads and things like that. So yeah, lots of advantages. I would add one more. If you get your urban core right, you concentrate all this stuff in that central area, and it becomes a tourist attraction.
Mhm.
It becomes a way that it becomes a phenomenon that you can sell to visitors both from across your state or across your metro area and across the country. And it also makes it easier to recruit companies.
Mhm.
The folks in this town who do recruit companies to Albuquerque or try uh, have repeatedly said that it would be a lot easier if our downtown was cool, and that is something we're trying to work on, I guess. But
Well, let's talk about downtown Albuquerque, and you've kind of I'm sure you did not have a understanding of what you were getting into when you sat down and started downtown Albuquerque news, but you kind of came in at an interesting time in
I did not
downtown
predict the pandemic. No.
that downtown history and really American history as it pertains to downtown areas. But kind of give us a thumbnail sketch of the recent history of downtown as you define it, whether it's kind of the broad trends since the war or World War II or some other time frame. But just thumbnail sketch it out about Albuquerque. It's never in my 18 years of living in Albuquerque and decades before that visiting Albuquerque, uh, having family here. This it was never, oh, you got to go downtown for X, Y, and Z. So I think it's safe to say that the city of Albuquerque, the state of New Mexico, have failed as a general rule to make downtown Albuquerque a tourist destination. We never made it a specific point visiting Albuquerque as a young person, as a kid. You got to go downtown and see X, Y, and Z. But why don't you share your thumbnail sketch of the history of downtown?
Sure, really thumbnail. I mean, there's the classic era from 1880 when the railroad gets there to roughly the war,
Right.
when it's sort of your classic downtown. And it's not that people went downtown at that point; they just were downtown. It was
There
just
was
like a
nothing else, right?
right. It was the city
Hmm.
at that point. And then, post-war, you get a lot of government encouragement of low-density suburbs, shopping malls, giant roads. You get, parking space mandates, which really
Hmm.
encouraged all that. And we can get into the pros and cons of that if you want, but so that kind of started to slowly let the air out of the balloon, downtown wise.
What was Windrock the first mall? I mean, like
Yeah, I think
1960-ish.
I mean a lot of the old timers will point to Windrock as like, oh yeah, that's when one of the shoes started to drop.
But clearly
Um,
there was kind of a heyday, if you will, of downtown, probably somewhere between 1945 and 1960-ish, and then with the kind of the malls and the shifting of economic activity to uh, not, I mean, suburban, I guess, areas.
totally. Yeah.
That's got to be kind of the start of the challenges that downtown Albuquerque and other
Oh
downtowns
yeah.
started to face.
Yeah, that's kind of, and it was a slow
Sure.
situation, but yeah, that just kind of continued. And we can talk about what other cities were doing to kind of push back on that phenomenon. But yeah, and then kind of I would put it to about 2000 or something. Then you have the rising homelessness situation. Fentanyl comes along, and then strike three is basically the pandemic and hybrid work, and so all of a sudden, you have a rough situation with a lot of characters wandering around downtown, and suddenly not a lot of people.
Well, you went through quite a number of years. That was
Well,
maybe a little thumbnaily even for me. I in other cities that I visited and have been in, certainly there was an increased challenge, I would say, from time I was born in 1975 until, let's say, the late 80s. And then there became a significant emphasis on downtowns that started to shift economic resources from the private sector, as well as things like sports stadiums and parks and other recreation activities. There became sort of a downtown renaissance. I don't know when you want to pin that date. I'm not talking specifically about Albuquerque here. I'm talking
Sure.
broadly
Yeah, yeah.
speaking. But you started to see that downtown revitalization happen. Denver being a perfect example, the
Sure.
stadiums and
Portland, yeah.
money flowing into downtown Denver and downtown other
The
places.
streetcar phenomena.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and we can debate whether those were wise uses of tax dollars and how effective they are in making uh, any area, including downtown, downtown Denver, a viable economic engine. But uh, there, so how would you characterize that era in downtown Albuquerque? I mean, it's fits and starts, and it's always been a challenged place. Would you ever say that there has been a modern heyday in Albuquerque? Like, I think
No.
things were starting to look better on the eve of COVID-19, though, right? I mean, it wasn't great, but it was better than it is now, significantly.
Yeah, I suspect that. I mean, things go kind of up and down
Sure.
anyway. I suspect that even if COVID had not happened, it might have continued to go up and down, maybe vaguely trending in an upward direction. But you still have a lot of headwinds here, right? Like you've got this. There was some movement towards remote or hybrid work even before the pandemic. So you
Fair.
got that. You've got homelessness. You've got fentanyl. You've got the problem that central business districts that don't have a lot of people in them after hours are kind of a bit creepy anyway.
Sure.
So you don't have a lot of people living downtown, or downtown adjacent. So uh, yeah, I mean, I think it was headed very slightly in a good direction before the
Right.
pandemic, but I suspect that if we'd let that play out without a pandemic, we would not be sitting here in 2024 incredibly impressed maybe modestly impressed with how it was going, but not necessarily partying like it was 1999 here.
So that's fair. I would say that obviously COVID had a dramatic impact and was kind of a tipping point, not to use the name of the show, but a tipping
Convenient.
point in the uh, remote work situation. And I'll throw this out there. So cities I go to, the downtown cores fairly often. Cincinnati, Ohio, where I'm originally from, Denver, Phoenix, Washington, D.C. Now, D.C. had horrible, horrible traffic and a lot of federal bureaucrats, and it hasn't recovered. Just D.C. has not recovered. Now, D.C. was a pretty phenomenal downtown on the eve of COVID-19. Uh, my friends and colleagues who spend even more time there say that it has fundamentally changed and dramatically and for the worse since COVID-19 with the lack of people commuting in. Cincinnati and Denver, they're they're pretty recovered, at least on site from COVID-19. I would say that downtown Albuquerque is much like DC, significantly unrecovered. Now, I'll add one quick point, which is that uh, there does seem to have been a shift in a positive direction with the state government. Now, as much as I decry government, too many jobs in government, too much money being dedicated to hiring bureaucrats, um, they have shifted a lot of people who otherwise would be in Santa Fe to downtown Albuquerque, and that has put butts in the seats of some of these office buildings. But what you tell me, what is your take on kind of where things are and how COVID really, some of these other details about downtown Albuquerque?
So wait, the current state of
Yeah,
downtown Albuquerque. I mean, it's not great.
right.
Commercial vacancies are pretty high.
What are we saying?
Um,
What are you approximate number?
I think it was like 20. Well,
Okay.
okay, but it's really actually hard to pin down. So like you
Right.
have the number and
Right.
then you have the reality that a lot of those people only show up 1 or 2 days a week.
Right.
So that's when I use commercial vacancies as a proxy for pedestrian footfall,
Hmm.
but it's a much more imperfect measure
Fair.
than it used to be. So yeah, we have a lot of vacant buildings. We have a lot of mentally ill addicts wandering around with some with particularly destructive tendencies.
Yeah.
Um, and yeah, I mean, I don't think it's going down the tubes. I don't think the data supports that. The number of vacancies has been fairly constant, for example, over the last few years, but it's not doing substantially better.
Right.
Even with positive developments like Ex Novo and the
Hmm.
forthcoming Arrive Hotel, it's in rough shape.
Right.
I wouldn't.
Ex Novo to me, and like I said, 18 years, it's the biggest deal I've seen hit downtown.
There was a 505 food hall a few years ago. I think that's the only
Yeah,
corollary.
that's
Uh,
fair.
but
What's this Arrive Hotel? Tell us about that.
yeah, that's the former Hotel Blue there at the corner of Central
Oh, yeah.
and 8th. And yeah, I mean, you could see the potential for the block of Central between 7th and 8th to be pretty rocking this time next year. I mean, you've already got Ex Novo.
Right.
You've got that auto dealership, not a dealership, sorry, a mechanics. They've got new ownership. They seem pretty bullish on the area.
Mango.
Yeah, Mango. Yeah, interesting name for an auto
Yeah.
business, but there you go. They seem to be doing it. You got a nice coffee shop. You got that the restaurant there on the corner, and you're going to have a hotel with some what I hear are some pretty cool stuff, businesses at the bottom of it. So you're going to have a block there with no vacancies basically, and some
Right.
cool stuff to do. You could easily kill an afternoon or two
Uh-huh.
uh, when it's all said and done there.
Well, let's talk about what I consider to be, and I'm sure you probably, hopefully, read the op-ed that I had with Doug Peterson
Oh yeah,
relating
we pay
to
close attention to that
the
stuff at
the TID slash TIF and the BID Business Improvement District. But ultimately, as we wrote in that, uh, and the journal echoed in its editorial, none of this is going to amount to a hill of beans unless you address crime. obviously crime ebbs and flows. You track that stuff pretty closely. Uh, how are we doing on crime in Albuquerque? And do you think it's a realistic picture in downtown Albuquerque? And do you think it's a realistic picture of what's actually happening?
Yeah, I mean, it's a rough part of town. I would divide crime into two categories downtown. One category is the really severe stuff that doesn't happen very often,
Hmm.
relatively speaking. So that's your homicides, your high profile shootings, and maybe street racing. Throw in that category. So the pretty severe stuff. Um, Luckily, quote unquote, that tends to happen overnight.
Hmm.
So that's no downtown restaurant owner, for example, likes to read stories about that happening at three
Hmm.
in the morning and then go into work. But it is at least somewhat isolated to the evening hours or overnight
Right.
hours. The second category gets back to the mentally ill addicts wandering around,
Right.
sometimes destroying stuff compulsively, and sometimes just entering businesses and causing various sorts of trouble, or sleeping in the doorways
Hmm.
without good bathroom access. I mean,
Hmm.
we can do the math on that. So to the extent that is crime, I mean, it's disorder. I mean, people debate back and forth to what extent that's crime, but it's certainly disorder.
It's a tiresome debate. I mean,
Yeah.
yeah, whether a homeless person, you can air quote it if you want, but whether that person sleeping in front of a business overnight and causing, you know, sanitary issues at the least is crime or not is really a moot point. It's, is this a serious problem and a challenge for people doing business in downtown and wanting to be downtown, and for the business owners in downtown or any other area of town? Really, it doesn't matter. it's
Yes.
it's it's
Yes
not
to all.
it's not something that people want to be around, and to the extent that people don't want to be around it, they're not going to be around it, and that is a serious obstacle to business. So
And it's extremely hard on the businesses. Like, I
yeah.
mean, if it's one thing if you're a 6 foot tall male owner operator of a small coffee stand or something like that. But like, if you want to hire someone
Right.
and have them operate the business alone, one of these folks comes in and starts causing trouble. I mean, what your options at that point are basically to call the police, and it might be a couple of hours, or to deal with it yourself
Hmm.
somehow. So the options are not great if you're operating a business in that situation. But I mean, this could lead us to the business improvement district idea,
Well, my
quite
next
handily if you
question's
want.
my next question is governance, and if you want to make the bid, I'll preface this by saying I just described the bid as I saw it in the article, but a bid is basically a elected fee that property owners in the given area, in this case downtown Albuquerque, and I don't know whether based on our definitions that we started out with at the beginning of the show, what that means
They're
for
going for
downtown.
more of the big buildings area.
Fair,
Yes.
right? That's what
Yeah.
I kind of figured, but you know, it's basically an idea to have a private governance structure that makes downtown a more hospitable location. Uh, I know you are not running for, well, maybe you are, but if assuming you're not running for office, we're
Definitely not.
talking about the political aspect of downtown Albuquerque. Do you see the bid as a solution? Is it one of a suite of solutions? Where do you think we need to go with downtown Albuquerque governance?
I mean, I think it's the standard, right? Like, all of these downtowns that you were describing that are doing better than we are have a bid,
Okay.
probably. Tucson has one, Colorado Springs has one, pretty sure Denver has one, El Paso definitely
Hmm.
has one. Uh, yeah, they're. I mean, I guess you can safely call it a potential solution, um, because it's. I mean, I these things are formed by property owners, and they do whatever the property owners want. So, and then they're run by them. So I've definitely seen other cities where bids do a lot to manage the sort of disorder crime
Mm-hmm.
category we were talking about before. They can do. I mean, bids are not going to do anything about street racing and homicides, but they can really help with managing the homeless and folks who are causing trouble in the downtown
And I
area.
think I don't know enough, and we don't have the details on what a bid in Albuquerque will look like. There have been previous efforts in
Yes.
this area,
Yep.
but I believe that the effectiveness or lack thereof of the bid, this is my personal opinion, is that if it can do something measurable about crime and homelessness, then it is something worth contemplating. If it can't move the needle on that, then it's not. So I think that
I
is a
mean, yeah,
fundamental issue.
there's it is, and there's nothing in particular standing in the way of them doing that should they choose to form the bid that way,
Hmm.
right? Like in Tucson, for example, their bid does a lot of things,
Hmm.
but a huge focus, if not the majority focus, is a kind of security eyes on the street initiative. So they've got, I don't know, maybe a dozen people and 24/7 coverage. So, but a team of about a dozen, I want to say, that is on call and walks around and enforces may be the wrong term, but prods people who are, say, camped out in an alcove
Hmm.
to move along or go somewhere else. Um, so and yeah, they are sort of like private security, but not quite. Yet
Hmm.
they still effectively manage the situation. Like you walk around downtown Tucson and you still see evidence of homelessness, but it is not nearly as acute as it is in downtown Albuquerque. And that's got to be because you've got this team of people going around doing their ask, tell, make procedure. So they ask someone to do something
Hmm.
that they want to change, then they tell them, and then they call the cops. So that kind of sustained nudging is something that can really help kind of I mean, it doesn't solve homelessness, but it does
Hmm.
kind of manage the problem to the point where you can operate businesses. And by the same token, if you're that solo proprietor and you have a situation and you need to get some help, they're 5 minutes away rather than a couple hours potentially away.
Right.
So I definitely talked to some folks in downtown Tucson who were like, yeah, we deal with what you deal with. Like people still walk in the door.
Right.
The difference is we can get help in a few minutes
Right.
and you can't.
And obviously, we're by help. Ideally, you're talking about police officers and the like. That is not easy to
Ideally.
achieve here in Albuquerque, and that is I believe, failure of especially this mayor. I believe that while I had certainly my political differences of opinion with Mayor Chavez, uh, you did have a much higher functioning police force, and I would put him in the best three mayors category that I've been around in my time in Albuquerque. Of course, R.J. Berry being in office before Keller, but after Chavez, and he kind of let the policing situation get away from him and the DOJ, et cetera. So uh, we got to at least talk about policing if you're talking about downtown
Well,
Albuquerque.
I mean, yes and no. I mean, I don't want to get into your your disagreements with the last few mayors about policing policy, but I will say that we're not the only town to have police shortages. I mean, they were complaining about that in
Fair,
Tucson.
fair.
We're not the only town to have a fentanyl epidemic, and yet other cities have used these, crack security teams funded by business
Interesting,
improvement
interesting
districts.
turn of phrase there, Peter.
Yeah, perhaps unfortunate. Uh, they do other things too. By the way, they're trained to recommend restaurants and
Sure.
be nice to people, say hi, and all that.
Well,
Create a good
something you
vibe.
find in a lot of these downtown areas is more butts in those seats, and maybe Denver lost 25%, Albuquerque lost 25%. Just throwing it out there, but Denver was starting from a much higher level in terms of people going to their
Sure,
downtown, and
their
that
bid's probably a lot older.
well,
I mean,
I'm
these things have been around since the 70s and 80s.
oh, I know, I
This
know,
has been like the
bids,
standard
but
for downtowns.
if you don't have the private sector jobs in that area, it's one thing to have a 10-to-1 working stiff versus homeless ratio, right?
Sure.
Uh, it makes the homeless problem a lot less of a problem if you have just a higher number of regulars, normies in that downtown area. In Albuquerque, you're getting close, just throwing out numbers here. We don't have actual ratios, but maybe a 2-to-1 or a 1-to-1
Yeah.
ratio between
It's
the
stark.
normies and the homeless. And that is a much different environment. And I know that you and I, for example, are not paid to work downtown, but there is a comfort
Well,
level that
I am a
people
bit,
are
but
going
yeah.
on the streets of downtown.
Sure. Yeah.
People are going to feel comfortable by the number of average, normal folks that they see walking around.
Sure.
That's just a fact
Yeah,
of
and
life.
so the way to get there, in theory, through a bid at least, and we can talk about where a TIF would come into this, but the way to get there in theory through the bid is to manage that situation to the point where people feel comfortable opening and operating businesses, and their customers feel comfortable going there, and then you just grow from there. Like it's not, I mean, it's not an insane phenomenon. I'm not guaranteeing that's going to happen if they do a bid, but that formula has worked in other cities.
Well, I guess my point would be that the bid has to be a part of a broader network of activities to bring more viable economic activities, more butts in those desks and those cubicles to downtown Albuquerque as well. And yes, I know we have a police shortage, but that doesn't mean we just wave the white flag. We also have to dedicate police resources and manpower and time. When I read that article, and I know Old Town versus Downtown, what that
Bit of a rivalry
does,
there.
yeah,
Yeah.
where that falls down. But it was in the paper, and when they had that so-called homeless man smash a bunch of windows and cause thousands and thousands of dollars of damage, there were articles in the paper about how they wanted one nightly police patrol in Old Town, which is the tourist destination, arguably, of Albuquerque. One police patrol. Now, I know there's not enough police. They're too busy dealing with a lot of stuff. But if you're going to make downtown an economic asset for the city and for the state of New Mexico, you've got to dedicate a little more police resources to it than that and be more aggressive in enforcing the law. And that's, I think, along the lines of all the things we're talking
Yeah,
about.
I mean, I'll say this much: I know very few people who would object to the city putting more police resources in downtown, particularly ones that kind of walk around, not necessarily just
Yeah.
respond to calls in the sort of greater downtown area. Walking around checking up on things.
Broken
And
windows theory, if you will. The Journal cartoonist on Sunday had a
there's
cartoon along those lines.
definitely some support for that sort of policing as well. I think here's where this kind of falls flat with a lot of downtowners and with me to some degree. It looks like a almost multi-decade psychodrama from our perspective.
Okay.
Like there's this long history of people saying we need more cops downtown. We need them to be more aggressive. And then there's this long history of 3 or 4 different mayors not getting that job done to the satisfaction of those critics. And it's we kind of watch this debate go on. And some of us have sympathies for one side, some of us have sympathies for the other. Sometimes it's in between. But the bottom line is that this stuff is not really changing to a huge degree. Now, if the mayor were here, he'd talk about the downtown substation, these new patrols, things like that. But the sort of the kind of vibe on the street hasn't really changed much in this department. And at the same time, we look to other cities like Tucson, and they have changed the vibe, and they've done it by downtown business owners getting together now and taxing themselves and having these security teams go out. Now, is that unjust? Should a decent city take care of that anyway? Sure, but that's kind of an academic argument, and downtown needs a solution yesterday. And so it's just like, it's hard to know where to go with this argument.
Well, to me, and unfortunately, we're getting a little short on time, but to me, if I was to wade into really engaging in this conversation, I would say that you need more jobs, you need more butts in those seats in downtown. That's where a lot of the property space is available. We're now
Sure.
a city that's a lot more hemmed in, although the office space situation is different from the residential situation. But we have this massive amount of oil and gas money coming in here to New Mexico. Dedicate that to tax reform and making New Mexico much more like Arizona, an economic dynamo. And we can say that, yes, Arizona is much more dynamic economically than New Mexico. And some percentage of that business activity and that dynamism will hit downtown. And ultimately, it will hopefully, over 5, 10 years, lead to kind of downtown that we see in Tucson or Phoenix or Denver or one of these more economically viable states. And the oil and gas money that we have can be used to reduce those taxes and to bring those businesses downtown. So it's a fully
But we're
systematic
still ignoring the
approach.
formula at that point. I mean, the formula for successful downtowns across the country is a business improvement district, sustained public investment either through a TIF or, whatever, the Tucson streetcar or something like that. I mean, are you thinking we can succeed where all these other cities have taken a different
I
direction?
would have to do more research to figure out how closely related a bid and a TIF. And the next question I was going to ask you, since we are short on time, the ART did not work out for downtown. Are you in the group of people who still supports the ART?
ART is one of those third rails that no good reporter can have an opinion on. So,
Okay, fair
I
enough.
will say this: like I've heard more complaints outside of the downtown core about ART, and I
Okay,
think that has to do with the acuteness of the construction. So in the downtown core itself, the stations
right,
are kind of off to the side;
right.
they're a little less intrusive. So it's not.
It's just another bus downtown. Let's be real. It's much more of a pain and much different from a regular bus up and down Central, right? I mean,
Yeah, I mean people are less phenomenized by
yeah,
buses around the downtown core
right.
than they are in say West Downtown or in Edo
Okay,
or
so
something like
last
that.
thing I want to make sure we talk about is this bike trail that the mayor has really put a lot of money in, where the money is on its way to be invested in this bike trail. Do you see this as a real boon for Albuquerque, and will the public safety, cops and whatnot, are they going to keep this path safe and clear enough, or is that a function that we're going to have to rely on the bid for to make this a positive endeavor for the city? Or where do you see this whole bike trail thing going?
Okay, so this is another thing where I can't make any future guarantees, but I can tell you what's happened in other cities.
Fair enough.
And if other cities have used these trails to inspire a lot of knock-on investment. So Atlanta being a sort of famous case where they have their Beltline trail. I went out there a couple of years ago, and it was pretty phenomenal just walking along the trail. You could hardly hear yourself think over the sound of apartments being built
Hmm.
around that trail. And there's a lot of trailside businesses, and yeah, it's a nice public amenity. So, in theory, we could do something similar, and to some extent, we have done something similar with the Bosque Trail. Like nobody's people don't think of the Bosque Trail as a sort of safety den of inequity very much. And there are some trailside businesses that have kind of
Hmm.
sprung up around it. So I'd say if you want a bullish argument, Albuquerque's built trails before. We kind of know how to do it, and there's every reason to believe that would inspire some knock-on economic development. On the other side, the argument would be we're still in the execution phase. It's going excruciatingly slow, and Albuquerque isn't good at maintaining things. So a reasonable person could both imagine this being a huge success and it being a poorly maintained place that nobody wants to go. It's going to depend a lot on how the next few years of execution happen.
Well, that is fair enough, and I appreciate your time today, Peter. We'll have to leave it there. But again, remind people how they can find and subscribe to Downtown Albuquerque News.
DowntownAlbuquerqueNews.com. Thanks for having me.
Thank you, and thanks for listening to this week's episode. Find all episodes at tippingpointsnm.com or at the Rio Grande Foundation's YouTube channel. Subscribe to this show at Apple, Stitcher, or tell Google Home to play Tipping Point New Mexico. Thanks to Path 3 Marketing for producing this show.